In November 1910, 7 men took a private train from Hoboken, New Jersey to Jekyll Island, Georgia. They represented 1/4 of the world's wealth. Over 10 days, in complete secrecy, they wrote the legislation that would create the Federal Reserve, America's central bank privately owned by the very banks it's supposed to regulate. This wasn't a government operation. This was a conspiracy in the literal sense of the word. 7 private bankers meeting in secret, using fake names, drafting legislation that would give them control over the entire American money supply. And it worked. On December 23, 1913, with most of Congress gone home for Christmas, the Federal Reserve Act passed. 3 years after that secret meeting, these 7 men had achieved what no king, no emperor, no conqueror had ever achieved. They privatized the creation of money itself. And here's what should terrify you. The Federal Reserve isn't federal, and it has no reserves. It's a private banking cartel with a government-sounding name. And in the 111 years since Jekyll Island, it has never been fully audited by Congress. Not once. This is the story of how 7 men stole the American money supply, why the banks that created the Fed now control the Fed, and why every dollar in your pocket is a debt instrument owned by private bankers. Because understanding Jekyll Island isn't just history. It's understanding who actually controls your money, your savings, and your economic future. And let me show you exactly what happened in November 1910. Who these 7 men were, how they pulled it off, and why you're still living under the system they created in secret 115 years ago. Before Jekyll Island, you need to understand the panic of 1907 because every major change to the financial system happens during a crisis. And the panic of 1907 was the crisis these bankers needed. In October 1907, the stock market collapsed. Banks failed across America. Depositors panicked and rushed to withdraw their money. Bank runs spread from New York to San Francisco. The entire financial system was on the verge of complete collapse. There was no central bank in 1907. America had tried central banks twice before. The first Bank of the United States, chartered in 1791, expired in 1811. The second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816, was killed by Andrew Jackson, Clear's throat, in 1836. Jackson called it the monster and said, "The bold effort the present bank had made to control the government is but a premonition of the fate that awaits the American people. Should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution?" Jackson won. America operated without a central bank for 77 years. But without a central bank, when the panic hit in 1907, there was no lender of last resort, no one to inject liquidity. The system was collapsing. Enter J.P. Morgan. John Perrant Morgan was the most powerful banker in America. His bank J.P. Morgan and Company controlled vast railroad networks, steel production, and financial institutions. When the panic hit, Morgan personally organized the rescue. He locked the major bankers in his library, forced them to pool resources, and stopped the bank runs through sheer force of will and concentrated capital. Morgan saved the system. But here's what most people don't understand. Morgan didn't save the system out of civic duty. He saved it to prove a point. The point was this: America needed a central bank, and the bankers should control it. The panic of 1907 killed 25 banks and trust companies. Businesses failed. Workers lost jobs. The stock market fell 50%. But J.P. Morgan emerged more powerful than before. He'd proven that private bankers could control the money supply better than the government, or so they claimed. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Freeland Act, creating a National Monetary Commission to study banking reform and prevent future panics. The chairman of that commission was Senator Nelson Aldrich, Republican from Rhode Island. Aldrich was one of the most powerful senators in America. He was also J.P. Morgan's business partner and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The commission was supposed to study European banking systems and recommend reforms. But what it actually did was provide cover for the bankers to write their own legislation. And they would do it in secret at a private resort where no one could see what they were creating. On the night of November 22, 1910, 7 men boarded a private rail car at Hoboken Station in New Jersey. They were told to come alone. No assistants, no secretaries. They were instructed to arrive separately to avoid being seen together. And most importantly, they were told to use first names only. No one could know who they were or where they were going. This wasn't paranoia. This was necessity. If the press discovered that the most powerful bankers in America were meeting in secret to write banking legislation, there would be riots. The American public hated the big banks. They hated J.P. Morgan. They hated Wall Street. Any legislation written by bankers would be dead on arrival. So they disguised it as a duck hunting trip. The private rail car traveled south for 1,000 meters. The destination was Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Jekyll Island was owned by a private club, the Jekyll Island Club, whose members included the Morgans, Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and Goulds, the wealthiest families in America. It was the perfect location, remote, private, exclusive, and most importantly, controllable. No outsiders allowed. The 7 men who arrived at Jekyll Island represented approximately $600 billion in assets measured in 1910. That's equivalent to roughly $20 trillion today. To put that in perspective, these 7 men controlled 1/4 of the world's wealth. Let me introduce you to the conspirators. Nelson Aldrich, the political power Senator Nelson Aldrich, Republican from Rhode Island, chairman of the National Monetary Commission. Aldrich was known as the general manager of the nation because of his control over Senate finances. He was one of the wealthiest senators in America, with investments in banking, sugar, rubber, and railroads. More importantly, Aldrich was family. His daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., making Aldrich the grandfather of the Rockefeller brothers, who would dominate American business and politics for the next 70 years. Nelson Rockefeller, Gerald Ford's vice president and governor of New York, was his grandson. Aldrich's job at Jekyll Island was simple. Take whatever the bankers created and guide it through Congress. Make it seem like a government reform, not a banker's takeover. Frank Vanderlip, National City Bank. Frank Vanderlip was president of National City Bank of New York, the largest bank in America and predecessor to today's Citibank. National City Bank was controlled by William Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller's brother. Vanderlip represented the Rockefeller banking interests. Vanderlip later wrote about Jekyll Island in his autobiography, admitting, "I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. Discovery would have been fatal to our plan. Fatal to their plan because the public would have rejected it immediately if they knew bankers wrote it." Paul Warburg, Lew and Company. Paul Warburg was Lew and Company. Paul Warburg was a partner at Lew and Company, one of the most powerful investment banks in America. But more importantly, Warburg was German. He came from the Warburg banking family of Hamburg and Frankfurt, one of the most influential banking dynasties in Europe. Warburg brought European central banking expertise to Jekyll Island. He'd studied the Bank of England, the Reichsbank, and the Banque de France. He knew how central banks worked in Europe, how they created money, controlled interest rates, and most importantly, how they enriched private bankers while claiming to serve the public good. Warburg was the intellectual architect of the Federal Reserve. The other bankers had power and money. Warburg had the blueprint. Benjamin Strong, J.P. Morgan's lieutenant. Benjamin Strong represented J.P. Morgan's interests. He was president of Bankers Trust Company, which was controlled by Morgan. Strong would later become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful position in the Federal Reserve System. Strong's job at Jekyll Island was to ensure that Morgan's interests were protected in the new system. And he succeeded. When the Fed was created, the New York Fed became the dominant regional bank, and Strong ran it for 14 years until his death in 1928. Henry Davidson, J.P. Morgan partner. Henry Davidson was a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. He was Morgan's most trusted lieutenant and one of the most powerful bankers on Wall Street. Davidson's job was to coordinate the meeting and ensure that all the bankers' interests aligned. Charles Norton, First National Bank of New York. Charles Norton was president of First National Bank of New York, which later merged with National City Bank to form Citibank. Norton represented another arm of Rockefeller banking interests. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. This is the most revealing member of the group. Piatt Andrew was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in President Taft's administration. He was the government official on the National Monetary Commission. His presence at Jekyll Island was crucial because it gave the meeting a veneer of official government business. But Andrew didn't represent the government. He represented the bankers. After Jekyll Island, Andrew left the Treasury and went to work for the bankers. coordinating the campaign to pass the Federal Reserve Act. For 10 days, these 7 men worked in complete secrecy at the Jekyll Island Club. They had the entire resort to themselves. No outsiders, no servants who might overhear. Just 7 men with one goal: create a central banking system that would be controlled by private banks, funded by the government, and presented to the public as a reform to prevent panics. Here's what they had to solve. Problem 1. Americans hated the idea of a central bank. Andrew Jackson had killed the second bank of the United States for exactly this reason. Any legislation that created a central bank would be political suicide. Solution: don't call it a central bank. Call it the Federal Reserve System. Make it sound like a government agency. Use the word federal to imply government control. Use reserve to imply stability and backing. Problem 2. Americans hated Wall Street and the big New York banks. Any system that appeared to give more power to JP Morgan or the New York banks would be rejected. Solution: create multiple regional Federal Reserve banks spread across the country. Make it look decentralized, but structure the system so that the New York Fed controls everything. Problem 3. The government might actually try to control it. If this was truly a government institution, elected officials might use it for public purposes instead of banker profits. Solution: make it privately owned by the banks themselves, but give it government backing. The Federal Reserve banks would be owned by private member banks. Now these member banks would elect the directors. The government would appoint some board members, but the bankers would run the system day to day. This was the genius of Jekyll Island. They created a central bank that looked like a government agency, operated like a private cartel, and had the power to create money out of nothing. Let me explain how it works in simple terms. Before the Fed, money was relatively simple. Gold and silver were money. Paper dollars were certificates redeemable for gold. Banks couldn't create money out of thin air. They had to have gold reserves to back their lending. The Federal Reserve changed everything. Here's the mechanism they created. Step 1. The government needs money. The US government wants to spend money it doesn't have. Instead of raising taxes or cutting spending, it issues bonds, IUS. These bonds promise to pay back the loan with interest. Step 2. The Fed buys the bonds. The Federal Reserve purchases these government bonds. But here's the trick. The Fed doesn't have money sitting in a vault. It creates the money out of nothing. Literally, it types numbers into a computer or used to print them on paper and exchanges this newly created money for government bonds. Step 3. The government spends the money. Now the government has money to spend. This new money enters the economy through government spending, military contracts, social programs, salaries, whatever. But this isn't money that was saved or earned. It's money that was created from nothing. Step 4. You pay the interest. The government owes the Federal Reserve interest on those bonds. Where does the government get money to pay interest? From taxes. From you. You work, you earn money, you pay taxes, and those taxes go to pay interest on money that was created from nothing. Step 5. The bank's profit. The Federal Reserve is owned by private banks. Member banks are required to buy stock in the Fed. They receive a 6% annual dividend on that stock paid from the Fed's profits. And the Fed's profits come from the interest on government bonds, interest paid by taxpayers. So here's what really happens. The Federal Reserve creates money from nothing, loans it to the government. The government spends it into the economy. You pay taxes to cover the interest, and the banks that own the Fed collect that interest as profit. You're working to pay interest on money that was created from nothing by private banks. This is the system the 7 men at Jekyll Island created. The Jekyll Island meeting ended in late November 1910. The bankers had their legislation. Now they needed to get it through Congress. This took 3 years of careful political maneuvering. First, they couldn't present it as the bankers' plan. Senator Aldrich introduced it as the Aldrich Plan in 1912, but it went nowhere. Everyone knew Aldrich was a banker ally. Democrats who controlled the House rejected it immediately. The bankers needed a new strategy. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson won the presidency. Wilson was a Democrat who had campaigned against the money trust in Wall Street power. He seemed like the last person who would support a banker's central bank. But Wilson had a problem. His campaign was bankrupt. He needed funding. Enter the bankers. Paul Warburg and other Jekyll Island conspirators supported Wilson's campaign through intermediaries. They gave him money. They gave him advice, and they gave him a chief advisor, Colonel Edward House, who was deeply connected to banking interests. After Wilson won, House became his most trusted advisor, and House pushed hard for the Fed. The Jekyll Island Plan was rebranded as the Federal Reserve Act, sponsored by Democratic congressmen to make it look like a reform against the banks. Not for them. Key Democrats, including Carter Glass and Robert Owen, were convinced that this was necessary to prevent another panic of 1907. The bill was introduced in December 1913. Here rests where the timing gets suspicious. Congress was scheduled to adjourn for Christmas recess on December 19th. Many congressmen had already bought train tickets home, but at the last minute, the leadership pushed for a vote before recess. The Federal Reserve Act was voted on December 23, 1913. Most congressmen had already left Washington for Christmas. Those who remained were exhausted and eager to leave. The bill was over 1,000 pages. Almost no one had read it fully. The president signs this bill. The invisible government by the money power will be legalized. The greatest crime of Congress is its currency system. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking bill. He was right, but it was too late. The Federal Reserve opened for business on November 16, 1914. Benjamin Strong, who'd been at Jekyll Island, became the first governor of the New York Fed. Paul Warburg became a member of the Federal Reserve Board. The Jekyll Island conspirators were now running the system they designed in secret. What happened next proves why they wanted this power. World War I started 3 months before the Fed opened in 1914. Coincidence? Maybe. But what's not coincidence is what happened next. The Federal Reserve financed America's entry into World War I by creating money to buy government war bonds. This allowed the government to spend far beyond its tax revenues. The Fed created $25 billion in new money during the war, doubling the money supply. This benefited the banks enormously. They earned interest on the war bonds. They financed arms manufacturers. They loaned money to European allies. J.P. Morgan's bank became the sole purchasing agent for Britain and France and America, earning commissions on billions in war purchases. World War I made the banks rich. The Fed made it possible by creating unlimited money. After the war, the Fed kept interest rates low and credit easy. This fueled the stock market bubble of the 1920s. Everyone borrowed money to invest in stocks. Prices soared. Bankers got rich off lending and underwriting. Benjamin Strong, running the New York Fed, deliberately kept rates low despite warnings about speculation. Why? Because higher rates would have killed the bubble, and the bubble was making his banker friends wealthy. In 1929, the bubble popped. The stock market crashed. Banks failed across America. Unemployment hit 25%. It was far worse than the panic of 1907. Here's the revealing part. The Federal Reserve had been created specifically to prevent panics and bank failures. But the Great Depression was worse than anything that came before. The Fed failed at its stated mission. Or did it? The Fed didn't fail the banks. It failed the public. During the Depression, the big banks, the ones that owned the Fed, bought up failed smaller banks at pennies on the dollar. J.P. Morgan, Chase, National Citibank came out of the Depression bigger and more powerful than before. The Fed could have expanded the money supply to prevent deflation. It could have been a lender of last resort to failing banks. Instead, it let the money supply contract by 1/3. This destroyed small banks and businesses, but allowed the big banks to consolidate power. This is what the Jekyll Island system was designed to do. Protect the big banks, concentrate power, and extract wealth from everyone else. World War II followed the same pattern. The Fed created money to finance World War II. Government debt exploded from $40 billion to $260 billion. The Fed bought government bonds, creating money to fund the war. Banks earned interest on the bonds. Defense contractors got rich. The public paid through inflation and taxes. In 1971, President Nixon completely severed the dollars linked to gold. Before 1971, dollars were theoretically convertible to gold. After 1971, the dollar became pure fiat currency, backed by nothing except the government's promise and the Fed's printing press. This gave the Fed unlimited power. If the dollar is backed by nothing, there's no limit to how many dollars the Fed can create. Let me show you what the Fed has done with this power. When the banks nearly collapsed in 2008 due to their own reckless mortgage lending, the Fed created $4.5 trillion to bail them out. Not a single major bank failed. Not a single executive went to jail. The Fed created money, bought toxic assets from banks, and made them whole. Meanwhile, 10 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. Unemployment hit 10%. Middle-class wealth collapsed. The banks that owned the Fed were rescued. You weren't. In March 2020, when COVID hit and markets crashed, the Fed created $4 trillion in 6 months. It bought government bonds, corporate bonds, even junk bonds. It gave unlimited loans to banks at zero interest. The result: stock markets hit all-time highs. Billionaires gained $1.8 trillion in wealth. Meanwhile, 40 million Americans filed for unemployment. Small businesses closed by the hundreds of thousands. The Fed created $4 trillion. Almost none of it went to working people. It went to banks, corporations, and the wealthy who own financial assets. By 2021, all that money creation caught up to reality. Inflation hit 9%, the highest in 40 years. Your money lost purchasing power. Gas, food, rent, everything got more expensive. The Fed's solution? Raise interest rates, which made borrowing more expensive, kill jobs, and crash the economy into recession. Regular people lose their jobs? Banks keep making money on higher interest rates. This is the system working as designed. Since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the US dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1913 costs $32 today. Your money loses value every year because the Fed constantly creates more money, diluting what you already have. This isn't accidental. This is inflation by design. The Fed targets 2% inflation annually. That means they deliberately devalue your money by 2% every year. Over a lifetime, your savings lose half their value. Meanwhile, the banks that own the Fed profit enormously. The Fed holds $5 trillion in government bonds. It collects interest on those bonds. Interest paid by your tax dollars. In 2023 alone, the Fed earned over $100 billion in interest from the government. The Fed sets the interest rates that determine your mortgage, your car loan, your credit card rate, and your savings account return. When rates are low, you earn nothing on savings, but the banks borrow cheap. When rates are high, you pay more on debt, but banks earn more. The big banks know they'll always be bailed out. They can take enormous risks because the Fed will create money to rescue them if they fail. You have no such protection. When the Fed creates new money, it doesn't distribute it equally. It gives it to banks first. Banks get the new money when it has full purchasing power. By the time that money circulates to wages and prices, it's been diluted. This transfers wealth from wage earners to asset owners, from you to them. You work harder for money that's worth less every year. They create money from nothing and collect interest on it. This is the Jekyll Island system. Remember those 7 men at Jekyll Island? The institutions they represented now control the Federal Reserve. J.P. Morgan's bank is now J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the largest member banks of the Federal Reserve and one of the biggest shareholders of the New York Fed. National City Bank is now Citibank, another massive Fed member bank and shareholder. The Rockefeller. Interests that controlled National City Bank through William Rockefeller are now dispersed through various banks and investment firms, but they still hold enormous influence in the system. The structure they designed ensures this. Member banks own the Federal Reserve. They elect 6 of the 9 directors of each regional Fed bank. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful, is dominated by the biggest Wall Street banks. Who owns the Federal Reserve? It's not the government, it's the banks. And who are the biggest banks? J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all descendants of or connected to the Jekyll Island. Conspirators. The Fed claims to be independent. Independent from whom? Independent from Congress, which represents the people, but not independent from the banks which own it. Since 1913, the Federal Reserve has never been fully audited by Congress. Efforts to audit the Fed have been blocked repeatedly. Ron Paul, congressman from Texas, introduced the Audit the Fed bill multiple times. It never passed. Bernie Sanders introduced similar legislation. Blocked. Why? What is the Fed hiding? The Fed's argument is that auditing would compromise its independence and politicize monetary policy. Translation: if the public knew how the system really worked, they would demand it be shut down. Here's what we know without a full audit. The Fed created $29 trillion in secret loans to banks during the 2008 crisis, revealed only after Bloomberg News sued for disclosure. The Fed holds secret meetings where policy is decided behind closed doors. The Fed's regional banks are private corporations owned by member banks. The Fed pays dividends to member banks before returning any profit to the Treasury. The Fed's financial relationships with foreign central banks are not fully disclosed. What don't we know? Everything else: the full extent of the Fed's power, its secret operations, and who benefits most from its policies. 111 years without a real audit. That's not independence. That's immunity. The 7 men who met in secret in November 1910 achieved something extraordinary. They created a private central bank with government backing, unlimited money creation power, and zero accountability. They did it in secret because they knew the public would reject it. They disguised it with names like Federal and Reserve to make it sound official. They passed it on December 23rd when no one was watching. And the system they created has transferred trillions of dollars from working Americans to banks and the wealthy over the past 111 years. Your purchasing power has collapsed, but $1 bought in 1913 requires $32 today. Government debt has exploded. $36 trillion in debt, mostly owed to the Fed and banks paid by your taxes. The banks have been bailed out repeatedly. 2008, 2020, every crisis. The Fed creates money to save them while you lose jobs, homes, and savings. Wealth inequality is at historic highs. The top 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90%. Enabled by a financial system that creates money for asset owners while devaluing wages for workers. This is not a bug in the system. This is the system working exactly as the Jekyll Island conspirators designed it. The Federal Reserve is not federal, and it has no reserves. It's a private banking cartel with the power to create money from nothing, charge interest on that money, and force taxpayers to pay that interest forever. It was created in secret by 7 men who represented 1/4 of the world's wealth. It was passed when Congress wasn't paying attention. And it has operated for 111 years without full accountability. Every dollar you earn loses value because of the Fed's deliberate inflation. Every crisis benefits the banks that own the Fed while you suffer the consequences. Every bailout is funded by creating money that devalues your savings. You cannot opt out. You're paid in Federal Reserve notes, dollars created by the system. You pay taxes in dollars. You save in dollars that lose 2% value every year by design. The creature from Jekyll Island isn't just alive. It's more powerful than ever. It controls your money, your economic future, and your country's fiscal policy. And it answers to the banks, not to you. Frank Vanderlip, one of the 7 conspirators, admitted decades later, "I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress." He was right. If Americans in 1910 had known that J.P. Morgan's bankers were writing the legislation in secret, it never would have passed. But they didn't know. The meeting was secret. The names were hidden. The legislation was disguised. And by the time the truth came out, it was too late. The Federal Reserve was established, and the system was locked in. Now you know the truth. 7 men, 10 days, Jekyll Island, November 1910. That's when your money was privatized. That's when the banks took control. That's why 115 years later, you're still living in the system they created in secret. If you want to understand how money really works, why inflation steals your wealth, and who benefits from every financial crisis, subscribe to this channel, because Jekyll Island wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the financial system that still controls your life today. The creature from Jekyll Island is real, and it's still feeding,